So we're gathered here for a couple of reasons: to encourage each other and to help each other as we face the days ahead of us, to strengthen our faith. I'm very cognizant of the fact that Yeshua himself said that in the last days that there would be struggles, that there would be wars, that there would be rumors of wars. And the Apostle Paul said that at the end, that the love of many would grow cold. He speaks about a falling away, which those of you that have studied that text knows that there's a lot of controversy about what that means. But I think the overall picture is that as we come to the end of days, there are going to be more and more difficult times. And there's a number of ways that we could approach that fact. That's my belief. I think the Scriptures teach that things are going to become more difficult, especially for those of us who claim the name of Yeshua and are willing to stand and not give in on that. So, the fact that the Scriptures teach us that, how are we to accept it? What is that to do for us? There's going to be something you'll hear me say over and over again in this conference as I seek to teach interpreting biblical prophecy. And I'm going to say it time and time again because I want you to go away from this conference with at least this well in your mind. And I'm doing what a lot of the writers in the Scriptures do, and that is I'm going to tell you the whole story in one short sentence. The whole thing, everything that I want to teach you, is in these two statements. Biblical prophecy in the Bible is given us for this reason: two parts. To cause us to see how great our God is. And then secondly, biblical prophecy is given to us in the Bible so that we will grow strong in our faith and serve Him faithfully today in light of what we know is going to happen in the future. Two things then. To cause us to see how great our God is and to make us strong in our faith as we read what He intends to do by accomplishing all of His holy will in this world. I can tell you what prophecy is not about, and you might be surprised. Prophecy is not about telling us exactly what's going to happen in the future and when. That's not what prophecy is about. And anybody that tells you prophecy is about that, you ought to have a red flag go up in your mind. As soon as somebody starts telling you, this is what's going to happen, this is how it's going to happen, and this is when it's going to happen, you ought to say, wait a minute. Where did you get that? Because that's not why prophecy was given to us. Prophecy was given to us to cause us to grow in appreciation for God's greatness, and as a result, to grow strong in our faith so that we can do what we're supposed to do today in light of what's going to happen tomorrow and in the future. Does that make sense? Now, in the time that we have, now, some of you came here, and actually I had it planned, that I would be going through various portions of the prophetic scriptures, including Daniel, Ezekiel, some of Zechariah, perhaps Jeremiah, Matthew 24, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1 Corinthians 15, and Revelation. I wanted to take little parts out of all of that. And so I dug in and started to prepare material, and I realized very early on that was going to be impossible. All you would get was just a smattering of what Tim Hegg thinks about this and about that. And really, that's not worth anything. You're not here to find out what Tim Hegg thinks. You're here to find out what God has said, what the Spirit of God is revealing, right? Am I right? You see, I don't want to come to a conference like this and just have you go away with something that you say, this is what I think. That comes and goes. It doesn't matter. You shouldn't base your life upon what some man thinks. You should base your life upon what God has said. And to use that old illustration, I don't want to come and give you food. I want to come and teach you how to find the food yourself. I don't want to give you a basket of fish. I want to teach you how to fish. Right? So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the Scriptures. First of all, we're going to look about how should we understand the Scriptures, and specifically, how should we understand prophetic Scriptures. I want to give you the tools, at least in a very general sense. I want to give you some criteria, some basic steps on what you should do when you're reading the Bible and how to interpret it, and specifically when you're reading the prophetic texts of the Bible, and what kind of tools you should use to interpret those. All right, let's get a general overview of where we're going. We're going to start by studying methods for interpreting Bible prophecy or biblical prophecy. And we start with hermeneutics. Now, hermeneutics is just a big word meaning how we interpret language, and specifically how we interpret the Bible. And I'm absolutely convinced that what's called the historical-grammatical hermeneutic is what God intends us to use. Now, I'm being very bold when I say that, and there are a lot of people who are good, solid believers who would disagree with me on that, but let me explain what that means. Just very briefly here in the overview, and we'll take more time as we go along. Historical means that when we read language, we must understand the point in history in which the language was written or spoken. Right? Okay. Now, I don't know. This is very difficult cross-culturally, and I'm recognizing that I'm speaking cross-culturally. Okay? But there's enough Americanese that has come to the Philippines and to Asia Pacific that this might make sense to you. Over in the States, the younger people have begun using words in ways that we never used them. Okay? Does that happen in the Philippines? Yeah, all right. So, not too long ago, I heard a couple of boys, they were standing by a bus stop and I was walking by, and a really nice car came by. And the one kid said to the other, "Man, that car's sick." That car's sick. Okay, now, have any of you heard that expression, like using sick that way? No, it's coming. It'll come across the ocean here pretty soon. You'll get it. Have you heard the word bad used that way? That car's bad. Yeah. But what does it mean when you say, that car's bad? What does that mean? That it's really nice, good. Well, they're using sick that way over in the States now. That car's really sick means that car's really cool, really good. Now, if you were reading that line in a piece of paper 1,000 years from now, and you had no idea about the history of American culture, you would have no way of understanding the meaning that person gave to those words. You would think that the car was on its last leg, that the car was ready to break down, that the car was really not running very well. Right? So, you see, the historical is needed in order to understand the meaning of the words. And then the grammatical. I mean, you've got to understand the language. You've got to understand how the language works. So we put the history and the grammatical together, and we come up with the historical grammatical interpretation, which is what I will stress when we get into that portion, why it is absolutely necessary that you hold to that and not give way on it. And then we're going to look about but does that work with the prophetic text? I mean, what happens if you have a lion that has wings and multiple heads? I mean, how can that be historical? Okay, we'll talk about that. We'll see how that works with prophetic text. And we're going to talk about how it's important to keep the big picture in mind. Now here's, again, if you want to write down some very, very important essential things to keep in mind all the time, it is this. In the Bible, and this is particularly true because Hebrews were the ones who wrote the Bible, okay? And the Hebrew way of doing things is to give you the whole picture first and then give you the picture again and again and again, only in smaller little chunks, bringing us down to specifics. Okay, let me give you a quick illustration. Have you ever noticed that Genesis 1 is the whole creation? You know, it goes all the way from day 1, all the way, at least at the beginning of chapter 2, to the 7th day. So all 7 days of creation are there. And then what's chapter 2 about? Creating the man and the woman, right? Right? Adam and Chava, right? So it gives us the whole picture in Genesis 1, and then it zeroes in on the most important part of creation, that which is created in God's image, that is mankind, male and female. So it gives us the whole picture, then it zeroes in. I was a chemistry major when I entered college, and I was a chemistry person when I was in high school, so I was going to go on and be a chemist. And one of the illustrations I like to use is the microscope. The microscopes that we had usually had 2 or 3 lenses that rotated, right? You had a 10, you had a 15, you had a 25. And so you would start with the 10 and look through and get everything, and then you would zoom it in to the 15 and then finally to the 25, right? So you don't want to look at the whole slide underneath the microscope. You want to look at one part, but you need the big picture to find that one part, and then you zero in on it. That's exactly the way biblical prophecy works. And I can show it to you time and time again. Think about it now. Just think about it. We're not going to even hardly touch on the book of Revelation. That's going to be your assignment for this next year, to put these principles together, okay? But think about it. In the book of Revelation, if you've read the book of Revelation, you know, we have these seals, we have these bowls of wrath, we have these trumpets, right? And there's 7 of each. Do you think he's telling the same story 3 times and just zeroing in on things? Everybody, not everybody, but a lot of people have interpreted that as being sequential. Is it sequential? Is it 21 things that are going to happen? Or is it him telling us the whole story at the beginning and then zeroing in on the more important aspects? So I commend that to your thinking. We need to keep the big picture in mind when the prophet takes us to look at the smaller parts of the big picture that are very important. We're also going to look at competing hermeneutical systems. I want you to be aware of the fact that there are other ways that people interpret prophecy, and I want you to be able to see that so that when you read things or when you hear things, you can say, oh, I know where he's coming from. I know what starting point he or she has when they interpret prophecy that way. And then we're going to look at specific hermeneutical principles just for interpreting prophecy. As I've already talked about, we're going to stress the purpose of prophecy and using the past to describe the future. That's very important. I mean, you can think of many illustrations of that right away. For instance, what did God do to Sodom and Gomorrah? He rained down hailfire on them and destroyed them, right? How many times did Yeshua use Sodom and Gomorrah as a way of talking about the future? He talked about Sodom and Gomorrah in terms of the judgment day, right? He said, if the miracles had been done in Sodom and Gomorrah that were done in your sight, they would have repented. Meaning what? That when it comes to the judgment day, your judgment's going to be even more severe than what came upon Sodom and Gomorrah. Oftentimes, the prophets use the past to describe the future. I might also say on that last point, they also use the very near future to describe the far off future. We'll see how that works. And then this apocalyptic genre. Now, when we say genre, you're probably all familiar with that word, right? Genre, because many of you probably speak French or some French. It's a French word, genre. It means kinds, okay? So when we're talking about apocalyptic genre, we're talking about different kinds of literature. For instance, when you read a recipe, you understand that all of the words are abbreviated, right? I've asked my wife, why don't they write the whole thing out? You know, like take 3 tablespoons of butter, put it in the bowl, mix it together with the flour and the sugar. That's not what they say. They say 3 TBLS period, mix W/butter, right? You know what I'm talking about, you gals and guys that, okay. So, but when you read that, you think, that's fine. That's no problem. When you read the fine print at the bottom of the of the form you're going to sign when you buy a house or something, and you read all that legalese, it is not the way you talk. But that's fine. Why? Because it's a different genre. When you read a Mother Goose rhyme, hickory dickory dock, the mouse ran up the clock struck 1, the clock struck 2, hickory dickory dock. You say, well, what's wrong with that? Nothing. As long as it's, you know, if I started out a lecture by saying hickory dickory dock, you'd all say, wait a minute, what are you talking about? You see what I'm saying? When you go from one kind of literature to another kind of literature, we automatically switch in our minds the kinds of words and so forth that we use. We're used to doing that. Well, guess what? That happens in the Bible too. Apocalyptic literature uses all kinds of interesting symbols and so forth. We're going to talk about what those are. And we're going to also survey the methods used in the history of prophetic interpretation. Now, the preterist view. What is that? Anybody know? Anybody hold to a preterist view here? Oh, I see I've got a student body here that I'm going to teach some things to. The historicist perspective, the futurist perspective, and the idealist perspective. Those are all alive and well in our world. And when you read various books, this person's going to interpret prophecy one way, and the next person's going to interpret the exact same prophecy a different way. You know why? Because they're starting from a different starting point. They have some presuppositions, and we're going to look at those. We're going to survey interpretive methods of prophecy. Have you ever heard of amillennialism? How many of you have ever heard of amillennialism? A few hands. Okay. Well, hopefully by the time you're through with this course in this conference, you're going to know what that is. Postmillennialism, any of you heard of that? Yeah, a few more. How about premillennialism? Yeah, okay. There's historical premillennialism and dispensational premillennialism. These are all very important parts of this whole doctrine or study of prophecy. You say, well, Tim, why do we need to know all these things? I cannot believe how much misinformation is out there. I'll be honest with you. I've not spent a lot of time in the past really studying prophetic texts. I spent more time in the book of Daniel in the last 3 months than I have in the rest of my whole life. I mean, I've read Daniel, I've heard it taught, but I got down to the Hebrew and Aramaic text and I studied it for myself, and it's a difficult book, at least it is for me. But as I began to read all of the commentaries that I had in my library and some that I didn't have in my library, you know what I realized? There's no consensus on prophetic texts. You go out on the internet and look and see, and you can find so many crazy different interpretations of prophetic texts, it makes some of us want to cringe. I mean, how many times in the history of modern Christendom have there been people who have said, the Messiah is coming back at such and such a time? Right? I mean, how many times has that happened? How many times have there been crazy leaders who have taken their people to, They told their people, their followers, sell everything you have. Let's go to Israel. We're going to stand on this mountain and the Messiah is going to return. And they're made to look like fools because it didn't happen. And you know what happens with that? Then people say, see, you people who believe in Jesus, you people who believe in Yeshua, that's all a bunch of nonsense. You have all of this stuff you believe that isn't true. And we bring the name of our Messiah into disrepute by such things. So it's important for us to know some of the starting points. Where did people, what are the presuppositions? Isn't that true with everything? I know it is. I'm sure that it is. Have you ever had this experience? It happened to me. It's happened to me numbers of times. Let me give you an illustration. The neighbor across the street asked me, they were going on vacation, and asked my wife and I if we would look after their house. I said, fine, we'd be glad to. I said, okay, well, you just need to go in once a day and check to make sure that the pet food is where it's supposed to be and that the pets have water and so forth and so on. Oh, and would you also just check the garage a couple of times because we have a freezer out there and we don't want the freezer, it's an older freezer, and if the freezer quits, we need to be notified so that we can, transfer all that stuff. And here's our key, a third key to the mailbox, and if you just bring our mail in. I said, great, no problem. So he told me, here's the key for the front door, here's the key for the garage, here's the key for the mailbox. And except for the one for the mailbox, the one for the garage and the front door looked pretty much the same. And the first time I went up and I put the key in the front door and it wouldn't turn. It wouldn't turn. It wouldn't turn. I said, oh, great. He gave me the wrong key. Now what am I going to do? And so I went and tried the key in the garage and it worked. And I thought, oh, I just had the garage key. So when I went back, and by the way, I should have said, I tried all the keys in the front door and none of them seemed to work. So I knew one was the mailbox key. I went and used one for the garage and it opened the door. I said, the third one has to be the front door key. I went back to the front door with the presupposition that this key would work, and guess what happened? It worked. I just had to wiggle it a little bit. As long as I knew that that was the right key, I was intent on making sure that it would work, and I stuck with it until it did work. Okay, now let's take that over to the Bible. If you start with the presupposition that the Bible is the inspired Word of God, that it is the very thoughts of God that are put down in words and in sentences and in paragraphs. If you start with that presupposition, and then you come to the text and something doesn't quite fit, what are you going to do? What is your conclusion going to be? I must not quite have something right. It must be me. On the other hand, if you come to the text quite certain that the Bible has mistakes in it, then when you find something that doesn't quite fit, what are you going to do? Oh, there it is again. The Bible's got mistakes in it. It makes all the difference in the world about your presuppositions, about where you start. Okay? Now, I want to tell you where I'm starting. I believe the Word of God, from the beginning to the end, is the inspired, infallible Word of God, inerrant in its original writings. And therefore, I believe we can trust it. And so when I come to something that I don't understand, you know what I do? I say, you know what? I don't understand this. I must not have enough information. I need to dig harder. I need to work harder. I need to pray more. I need to think. I need to just wait and say, Lord, I don't understand this. But I want to. And instead of saying there's something wrong with the text, I say there's something wrong with me. I need to understand more. Now that's why we're going to study these different forms, these different ways of interpreting the prophetic text. Because you need to know when you're reading somebody on the internet, when you're reading something in a book, when you're listening to somebody in a lecture, you need to say, what's his or her starting point? Where do they begin? That will make a big difference. And then you know what we're going to do. We're going to take what we've learned about how to study the Bible in terms of the hermeneutics, interpreting it, especially how we're to interpret prophetic texts, and then we're going to apply it to a study of the book of Daniel. If the Lord is willing, by the time we're done with our conference, we will have studied all the way through the book of Daniel, chapter by chapter. Now, how certain am I that I understand the book of Daniel? Well, I'm pretty certain that I understand its general message. I would say I'm very certain that I understand the general message of the book. How certain am I that my interpretations of how the book plays out are 100%? I would say, I don't think I would fall on my sword for everything that I'll be teaching about the book of Daniel. But at least I will show you how we can utilize these methods of interpreting prophetic texts and how I would utilize them as we study Daniel. So we're going to use it to demonstrate the principles of interpreting prophetic texts, to understand the prophecy of Daniel. And you should realize that Daniel is foundational for understanding Revelation. You really can't understand Revelation until you understand the book of Daniel. And this is another thing that happens all the time. People go rushing to the book of Daniel when they haven't studied, the book of Revelation, when they haven't studied Daniel, they haven't studied Zechariah, they haven't studied Ezekiel, they haven't studied Isaiah. You can't understand Revelation unless you understand the prophetic text of the Tanakh. I guarantee you that. And so, if you want to, or someone wants to take you right into the book of Revelation and say, look, this is what it means, this is how it works out, so forth and so on, and you're not seeing that they are applying the interpretation of the book of Daniel and other books of the Tanakh, red flag needs to go up. I guess what I'm teaching you is how to get some red flags up. I don't want you to be snookered by all of the craziness that's out on the internet. And while I'm on my soapbox on that one, I'll just say this. I don't have very much time for all of these people that are going around teaching prophecy, and it seems to me that their goal is to scare everybody to death. The goal of prophecy, the purpose for prophecy in the Bible, is not to scare us to death. The goal of prophecy in the Bible is to increase our faith so that we're not fearful. There's messianics that are going around in the United States at least talking about how the dollar's going to fail and the economy's going to go into the tank and everybody's going to be out on the street starving to death and so forth and so on. And then they get done and take an offering. If I was at a conference like that, I wouldn't put any money in the basket. You just told us that times are going to be worse than ever and you scared me to death. And I'm supposed to pay you for this? There is something, however, about prophecy that does bring fear, and that's when the prophet tells us the reason that God's wrath is coming is because we've been disobedient. And then it's time for us to reassess who we are in Yeshua, what our lives are, and what we're doing. And that's what I mean when I say it causes our faith to grow. We come to repentance before God and we say, we have strayed from your ways. We have gone away from your ways. Forgive us and bring us back and cause us to walk in your ways. And then we're strong. We're like the three in Daniel. The king said, worship me. If not, I'm going to throw you into the fire. And what was their response? Well, throw us into the fire. If God saves us, he saves us. And if he doesn't, so be it. Those three men had faith. They had strong faith. That's what the study of prophecy should be. And I have to tell you, the last 3 months when I have dug into the book of Daniel, and Caleb, who works with me all week in the same office, can tell you that I'm there when he shows up in the morning and I'm there when he leaves at night. And it's pretty much been Daniel. Daniel. I can tell you something. That what I realized by studying the book of Daniel, which was so precious to me, was number one, how great my God is, and number two, how much I can trust him. That's exactly what prophecy is supposed to do. Daniel is one of the biblical books written in an apocalyptic style. We've got all kinds of symbolism and all kinds of creatures and all kinds of visions, and it's that kind of literature. So what is our goal in this seminar? It's to gain an insight into how biblical prophecy works, to gain insight and understanding of how to utilize a proper hermeneutic when interpreting biblical prophecy, and to gain a better understanding of some of the primary prophetic texts in the Bible, particularly Daniel. So what can you expect from this seminar? A better understanding of how to interpret biblical prophecy, that is, if you listen, if you don't fall asleep, which you might, and that would be my fault, not yours, or unless the food's too good. Some insights into various prophetic passages of the Scriptures. We're going to look at a few others besides Daniel and see how they apply. There will be a challenge to grow in your faith and love for God. And to me, that's the most important thing. I hope that when you go away from this conference, you'll say, I have a new grasp on loving God and living for Him, because I see how much He is in control. And I understand what He's done in history, and I know that He holds the future, and I'm in Him, and I'm safe in Him. And here's what you will not get out of this seminar. You won't get answers to all your questions about biblical prophecy, I guarantee you. I will be very happy to respond to some of your questions with this answer. I'm sorry, but I don't have a clue what the answer is to your question. And by the way, I would say any prophecy teacher that you hear that has answers to all your prophecy questions, I would think twice before you believe everything he tells you. And why is that? That's because God does not give us all the answers until things actually are fulfilled. He gives us some of the answers, but He doesn't give them all to us. Why? Why do you think God doesn't give us all the answers? Well, it would just make us proud, right? Number two, would it increase our faith? Probably not. And number three, we might stop reading the Bible. We might stop drawing close to Him, because once you have it all, you don't seek Him anymore. Another thing you're not going to get in this seminar is a time chart of future events. I'm not going to tell you when stuff's going to happen, because I don't know. And I'm not going to give you any hidden secrets that have never been known before. I don't think there are very many of those. Personally, I think some of the people, some of the teachers, many of the teachers perhaps who came before us were wiser than we were. I hope that we can gain some new insights for ourselves, though, into the Scriptures, and that's what I hope you'll receive from this seminar. I'm going to take just a couple more minutes to go over a few essentials. Now, here's the reality. Our hermeneutic will determine the outcome of our study on prophecy. What we believe about how the Bible is to be interpreted will indeed determine the outcome of our final interpretations. What is the goal of the historical-grammatical interpretation or hermeneutic? It's very simple. When you read the Bible, the first goal you ought to have is to ask, what does the author mean? Now, you know, I think most of you have been listening to me if you've been trying to stay attentive in this warm afternoon, and you've understood my language. I know that you've understood my language because sometimes when I've said a few comical things, you've laughed. That means you were listening to me. My words had meaning to you, and when you interpreted my words, you gave them the same meaning that I was giving to them. Right? And that's how we call communication. Now, when you were singing the national anthem for the Philippines, the Republic of the Philippines, I didn't understand a word you said, because you were speaking a language I don't know. So even though you were speaking meaningful words or singing meaningful words, they had no meaning to me because I could not attach the same meaning to the words as you were attaching to them. Okay, So the first goal in reading the Scriptures is to find the author's meaning. How do you do that? You presuppose that words carry meaning. Now, words themselves don't have meaning. We'll talk about that in a minute, or maybe next session. But words carry meaning. What are words? Words are simply symbols that attach to a reality, right? If I say tree, a picture comes in your mind. Now, some of you are going to have a picture of an apple tree. Some of you are going to have a picture of just a generic tree. Some of you might have a picture of a coconut palm or something. But tree is going to mean the same thing to us all because we know what we're talking about. The word tree connects to a reality that's in our world. Am I getting too philosophical for you? Okay. So when you read the words of the Scriptures, you're going to have to say, what did the author mean by these words? And that's your first goal. The next thing we're going to have to talk about is the method. Words, phrases, sentences, and paragraphs, context, carry the author's meaning. The worst thing we can do when we study the Bible is take things out of context. You know how you keep from taking things out of context? You study the whole context. Do you want to know what Daniel is saying? Don't just read chapter 7, verses 24 through 27. Don't just read Daniel 9, 25 through 27, and base your prophecy on that. You haven't understood Daniel. That'd be like taking one paragraph out of a love letter. If you took one paragraph out of a love letter, it could become a not so great love letter. Right? I mean, think about it. Here's John writing to Susie, and he's writing this long letter about how he loves her dearly, and how he finally has come to understand that she's the only one for him. But in the middle of this letter, he writes a paragraph that says, you know, last week I was really questioning whether you were the right person for me. And frankly, we've been away from each other for a while, and I was starting to think that maybe this wasn't going to work. And then you just pull that paragraph out, and you say, what's this letter about? Well, it's a Dear John letter, or a Dear Jane letter. It's a goodbye, I'm out of here letter. Well, you'd have it 100% wrong, wouldn't you? Because the next paragraph says, but after thinking about it, I realized I was wrong. I realized you are the only one for me. You see how you have to have context? Why do we think that we can take a verse here and a verse there and a verse over there and pull them together and make a theology of the end times? Don't let people do that to you. Don't let teachers do that to you. Work hard to find the context. Words gain their meaning from textual context, the grammar, the syntax, the genre. You know one of the problems with written language? We can't oftentimes put in inflections. Take the word well in the English language. Now I'm speaking as an American, I know, so bear with me, okay? If I say, well, what does that mean? Well, what's your answer? Or, well, what are you going to do about it? Or, well, how about getting your act together? Right? If I say, well, or well and good. If I was more British, that would mean you did a good job. If I draw it out, if I say, well, then what does it mean? It means I'm thinking about how to give you an answer, right? I mean, do you see how language works? Well, how do you write that down? You know, this is why I know that I'm in the texting capital of the world, right? Right? Okay? Got my phone right here. Okay? You know, we have all these little icons, right? You can put a smiley face, you can put a frowning face, you can put a mouth that kind of goes up and down. Why do we do that? Well, because we're trying to add inflection to our words. How do we discover the meaning of the author in these kinds of things? There are some scholars who say we can't. There are some scholars who say that we have lost the ability. Uh-oh. What happened? I'm sorry, Ted, but your light went off. Uh-oh. Anyway, okay. How can we find the author's meaning without having the inflections? Some scholars would say it's impossible. It's impossible to recover the meaning of the author in the biblical text. I disagree. I think the Spirit of God has given us that, but we must study it in its larger context. When you really honestly study carefully, when you study biblical texts, you begin to get a sense of the author's way of doing things, the author's way of saying things. You begin to hear his inflections in his language. So we have to keep all that in mind: grammar, syntax, genre. You say, Tim, I'm not a language scholar. Well, some of you are. I've already talked to some of you. Some of you are teaching Hebrew. Some of you are teaching Greek. Baruch Hashem. Bless the Lord. That's what Baruch Hashem means. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Okay? And I realize not everyone's going to be able to do that. But when you're listening to a teacher, when you're listening to something or reading something off the internet, when you're reading something in a book, ask yourself this question: does the author, does the teacher evidence the fact that he or she has done his or her work to understand the grammar, to understand the syntax, to understand how the author is putting words and phrases and sentences together? If you say, well, no, they never talk about that, then I would just put a little question mark about, okay, maybe I need to check with others on this same text to see what they're saying. How about the historical context, the stage of the language, and current events? If I were to say to you, and I think this will even work in the Philippines, if I was going to say to you, that will be a 9/11 kind of a day. You all know what I mean? Okay. If someone had said that in the 1800s, would they have understood it? No. They say, wait a minute, what does he mean? A 9/11 day. Let's see. 9/11. 9/11. 9 is the number for what? Is the number 11 is the 9/11. What does that mean? They wouldn't know. They wouldn't know until September, right? 11th. 1001. Okay. But we all know it's a day of tragedy that happened in the United States of America, and it's become a phrase which is only understood in the context of history. Okay? I think the same thing's going on in Daniel, in Revelation, in other books. If we can glean the history of the time, we can maybe begin to understand some of the language that they otherwise wouldn't. There's cultural context, idioms, colloquialisms, which I've already demonstrated with the word bad or the word sick, used in a strange way than from its normal meaning. And I'm coming to the end of our session here, so we're not going to rush. We're going to try to get everything in, but we're not going to rush. And so I'll just take a couple more minutes, and we'll close off this section. There's the textual context, which is grammar, syntax, and genre. Let me give you an illustration. This is classic. He says in Genesis 40:13, within 3 more days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office. Remember, this is Joseph giving the interpretation of dreams, right? To the baker and to the cup holder of Pharaoh. Okay? In verse 19, he says, within 3 more days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and will hang you on a tree. Now, lift up your head in verse 13 means just the opposite of lift up your head in verse 19. Okay? See, you can't do a Strong's word study and say, oh, it's exactly the same word. Lift up is the same word in verse 13 and verse 19. Therefore, it means the same thing. It doesn't mean the same thing. Why? Because the context is different. In fact, it's a play on words. It's a tongue-in-cheek. God's going to lift up your head and he's going to lift up your head, but it's going to be two different ways, you'll see. And if we can throw another one in. Exodus 30, verse 20, he tells the priest, when you lift up the heads of the sons of Israel. What does the same exact phrase mean there? It means to count them. Count heads. So you can't just say it's the same Hebrew word and think it has the same meaning. This happens in poetry. But you, O Lord, are a shield about me, my glory, and the one who what? Now we have lift up your head, meaning restore you to your office. Lift up your head, meaning hang you to death. Lift up your head means count you. Or lift up your head in Psalms means what? You're the lifter of my head, meaning what? Maybe one who brings me encouragement, one who restores me to my office of king, or whatever. Okay? It happens again in Zechariah. That's apocalyptic literature. I said, what are these coming to do? He said, these are the horns which have scattered Judah so that no man lifts up his head. What does it mean, no man lifts up his head? You're ashamed. You're hiding. You're fearful. So do you see that words do not have meaning? Now you might think, wait a minute, Tim, isn't that what you're just talking about? Yes, words do not have meaning. Meaning has words. You can't do a Strong's number search and find meaning. Here's a challenge for you if you want a fun little game. Take any paragraph out of the local newspaper, maybe just a sentence. Take a sentence out of the local newspaper. Open up Webster's, I'm talking English now, excuse me. If it's in Tagalog, I don't know what to do. But if it's in English, open up Webster's dictionary and look each word up and then take the first definition given you and write it down. Okay? And when you get done doing that for each word in the sentence, now see if you read the words that you wrote down, which are the first meaning given in Webster's dictionary for that word, and see if it makes any sense. I guarantee you it won't. Why? Because words have different meanings in different contexts, right? So you can't just look up the Strong's numbers and think you have the meaning of the words. So just because different biblical texts use the same words does not necessarily mean they're talking about the same thing. The context must determine the meaning of the words in that context and not vice versa. You can't bend a context to the meaning of two words that are used one place and another place. You have to let the context determine the meaning of the word. Okay. Now, what are you going to do about questions that you have? Well, you're going to write down your questions. So if you have questions, there is some blank space somewhere on those pages. On the side of each page, I left you blank space in your little seminar booklet. Write down your questions, because I really think your questions are very important, and I want to answer those questions, or at least speak to them as I'm able.